Jason Miller stood on the ladder outside Megan Price's back porch, one hand braced against the gutter, laughing at something she'd just said. She held the ladder steady below him, sleeves pushed to her elbows, hair still damp from a shower she'd taken 20 minutes earlier. The laugh died fast. Her phone buzzed on the railing. A name lit the screen, and something behind her eyes closed like a door swinging shut. She let go of the ladder without a word, walked into the yard, and answered in a voice he had never heard her use: flat, fast, final. Jason stayed where he was, wrench in hand, watching a woman he thought he knew disappear into someone else. Some people help without ever asking who they're helping. Stay with this story because in a few Sundays, the answer to that question changes everything. Ellie Miller had learned to sleep through the sound of lawnmowers by the time she was 6, and by 9, she could tell the difference between her father cutting their own grass and cutting someone else's just by the rhythm of it, steady and unhurried at home, careful and precise next door. Jason had held the same job description in his head for 11 years before Meridian Supply Co. cut it out of him. Quality control lead, warehouse and receiving, third largest distribution hub in the state. He had been 4 months clear of that badge now, working part-time maintenance for the apartment complex 2 streets over, patching drywall and fixing garbage disposals for a landlord who paid on time and asked no questions. It was not the life he had planned. It was the one he had. Megan Price had moved into the house next door 6 months before that Sunday, arriving with 2 moving trucks and a silence that made the whole block curious for about 3 weeks before they gave up trying to place her. She kept no lawn service. She hired no one to manage the mail. The house was, by design, the one part of her life that did not know what she did for work, and she meant to keep it that way, a place with no logo on the mailbox, no driver idling at the curb, nothing that connected the woman watering her tomatoes to the name printed at the top of quarterly earnings calls 3 states over. 10 weeks before the ladder, before the phone call, before any of it, Jason had come home on a Sunday to find his new neighbor standing over a lawnmower that would not start, sleeves rolled, hands smudged with oil, muttering at the machine like it owed her money. He crossed the yard without thinking too hard about it. 10 minutes and 1 clogged fuel line later, the mower turned over, and she looked at him like he'd performed a small miracle. "Let me pay you something," she said. "It's a fuel line," he said. "Buy Ellie a candy bar sometime. We're square." She laughed, surprised by it, and something in the sound made him want to hear it again. The next Sunday he came back without being asked. She had coffee waiting, 2 cups, like she'd known. Neither of them mentioned it as a plan. It simply started happening, the mower, then the gutters, then the fence post that leaned a little more every month, small jobs that gave the morning a shape. They talked about the weather, about delayed flights, about the particular ache of a long week, and never once about what either of them did to fill the other 5 days. It wasn't a rule. It was just never the question that came up, the way you don't ask a stranger holding a ladder for you what their 5-year plan is. By the 3rd Sunday, Ellie had started coming along, sitting cross-legged in the grass with a coloring book while her father worked, and Megan pretended not to watch the 2 of them like something she'd once had and lost track of. By the 5th, Megan had stopped disappearing into the house the moment the work was done. By the 10th, it wasn't a favor anymore. It was just Sunday. The rest of the street had their theories about the quiet woman 2 doors down, that she worked for the government, that she was some kind of consultant, that she was recently divorced and licking her wounds in private. Nobody asked her directly, and she never offered more than a polite deflection when they tried. Jason never asked either, though not because he lacked curiosity. It was something closer to respect, the same instinct that kept him from telling strangers the particulars of what he used to do for a living. A person's other 5 days belonged to them. Sunday was the only day that belonged to both of them, and that felt, most weeks, like more than enough. The hardware store on Forest Hill Avenue was the kind of place where Jason still ran into people from his old life, and that Tuesday it was Marcus Doyle, who used to run inventory 2 aisles down from him at the Meridian Distribution Center. Marcus looked older than 4 months should have made him, And he said what people always said first, sorry about the layoff. Man, that whole thing was a mess before he said the thing Jason hadn't expected. They almost gave you regional ops before all that. You know that, right? Kimball's office had the memo drafted. Then it just vanished. Week later, you're on the list with the rest of us. Jason stood there with a box of drywall screws in his hand, doing the math he'd avoided doing for 4 months. He had reported it himself, 3 weeks before the layoffs, a receiving discrepancy in the warehouse ledgers, numbers that didn't reconcile no matter how many times he ran them, a gap just under 6 figures that kept resurfacing every quarter like a stain nobody wanted to scrub. He'd filed it the way he was supposed to. He'd never heard another word about it. And then, his name had shown up on a list of 40 employees let go in a routine restructuring, buried deep enough in the paperwork that nobody, not even Jason, not for a long time thought to ask why a man who'd flagged a warehouse discrepancy and a man who'd nearly been promoted for his diligence were the same person getting cut in the same breath. He didn't say any of that to Marcus. He bought his screws and drove home with his jaw tight, the old bitterness sitting where it always sat, low and familiar, like a bruise he knew how to avoid pressing. He didn't bring it to Megan either. It wasn't the kind of thing you handed to a woman you'd known for 10 Sundays, not when the friendship still felt like something that could be startled off if you moved too fast. That same afternoon, Ellie was on her knees in Megan's side yard, transplanting a struggling basil plant into a bigger pot while Megan knelt beside her, dirt under her fingernails for the first time anyone on the block had seen. "You have to be gentle with the roots," Ellie said, with the total authority of a 9-year-old who had read 1 page of a gardening book. "If you yank it, it dies." "Duly noted," Megan said, and did exactly as instructed, packing soil around the stem with more care than the moment strictly required. Ellie watched her work and said, without any weight behind it at all, that her mom used to grow basil too before she got sick, and Megan's hands went still for half a second before she kept going, saying only that it sounded like her mom had good taste. It was a small thing. It didn't need to be more than that. But it was the first time Jason, watching from the porch with a mug going cold in his hand, thought that, whatever this was becoming, it had already stopped being simple. Megan's phone rang 40 minutes later, cutting through the quiet with the specific urgency of a call that could not be ignored. She read the screen, exhaled once, and told them both she was sorry. Something had come up. She needed to get back to it. She left earlier than she ever had on a Sunday, her car pulling out of the driveway while Ellie was still packing away her tools, and Jason stood there a moment longer than necessary, watching the space where her car had been, wondering not for the first time, and not the last what it was, exactly, that Megan Price went back to when Sunday ended. The routine had a shape to it now, one that didn't need discussing. Jason arrived a little after 8, before the heat set in, and worked through whatever the week had broken a fence post that leaned a little further every month, a porch light with a short in it, gutters that clogged faster than any gutters had a right to. Nobody called it a job anymore, not even in their own heads. It was just what Sunday was for. He was up on the porch roof checking a soft spot in the shingles when the radio in his truck, left running low for company, caught a local news segment about Meridian Supply Co.'s third-quarter restructuring. A voice, smooth and rehearsed, crediting improved efficiency and long-term stability for shareholders. Jason recognized the voice before the anchor said the name. Roger Kimball, Vice President of Operations, talking about efficiency like it was a virtue he'd invented. Jason's jaw tightened. He reached over and turned the dial without a word, and if Megan noticed him do it from where she stood in the yard, she didn't ask why. She had started staying outside longer these days, not retreating into the house the second the last task got crossed off. She'd bring out 2 glasses of water, sit on the porch steps, and let the conversation wander somewhere further than lawn care and weather. She asked him what Ellie was into these days, and he told her about the dinosaur phase that had somehow lasted 2 years running. He asked whether she ever got tired of the travel, and she said something vague about it being easier some weeks than others, the kind of answer that closed a door as politely as it could. Neither of them minded the door. It wasn't suspicion. It was simply an unspoken agreement that whatever sat behind it belonged to each of them alone, the way a person's grief belongs to them even when someone else is standing close enough to see it. By mid-afternoon, a wind picked up out of nowhere, and the blue tarp Jason had laid over a stack of lumber in the side yard tore loose from its stakes and started flapping like something trying to escape. They both went for it at once, grabbing opposite corners, wrestling it back down against the gusts, laughing despite themselves at how undignified the whole thing looked. When they finally got it pinned and folded, his hand landed over hers on the last corner, both of them reaching for the same stake at the same moment, and neither one moved first. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. It felt longer than that to both of them. "Good catch," she said, pulling her hand back like nothing had happened, though her voice didn't quite land the way she wanted it to. "Team effort," he said, and went back to hammering the stake down harder than it needed, because it gave him somewhere to put his hands that wasn't reaching for hers again. They didn't talk about it. They didn't have to. The Sunday ended the way it always did, with her walking him to the edge of the yard and him telling Ellie to grab her things, and neither of them said a single word about the 2 seconds on the tarp, though both of them carried it with them for the rest of the week, in the particular way a person carries something they aren't ready to name. It came up sideways, the way most true things did between them. Jason was replacing a cracked hose bib and mentioned, mostly to himself, that he'd picked up an extra Saturday shift at the apartment complex because Ellie had a science project do something about erosion, poster board and sample soil, and a battery-powered fan, $40 of supplies he hadn't budgeted for that month. He said it the way a man says something he doesn't want turned into a conversation, and Megan let it pass without comment, which was its own kind of kindness. 2 days later, a canvas bag appeared on the miller's front step sometime before dawn. Poster board, a small clip-on fan, a bag of potting soil, no note, no name. Jason knew exactly who it was from the moment he saw it. The same way he'd known, without being told, that some kindnesses were meant to be received quietly and not thanked out loud. He didn't call her. He didn't text. The following Sunday, he left a small box of oatmeal cookies on her counter while she was inside filling water glasses. Said nothing about it, and neither did she when she found it, though the corner of her mouth gave her away for half a second before she caught it. That was the whole exchange. Neither of them needed more than that. Ellie's erosion project won second place at the school science fair the following Friday, a small blue ribbon she taped to her bedroom door and refused to take down for a month. Jason told Megan about it the next Sunday almost as an afterthought, the way a proud parent tells a story they've already told twice that week, and she listened to every detail like it mattered as much to her as it did to him, which, by then, it nearly did. Later that afternoon, sitting on the back steps while Ellie chased a moth around the yard, the conversation drifted somewhere neither of them had steered it before. Jason mentioned, without much weight in his voice, that his wife used to be the one who handled things like science projects. She'd had a patience for glue sticks and construction paper that he'd never developed, and 4 years later, he still caught himself reaching for a competence he didn't have. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. Megan listened the way people listen when they're recognizing something in a stranger that they carry themselves, and when it was her turn to offer something back, all she said was that she understood what it was to build a life around an absence, though she didn't say whose. He didn't push. She didn't explain. It was enough, that afternoon, to sit with two people who each knew what it was to carry something they didn't set down in front of just anyone. Ellie wandered over eventually, moth forgotten, and flopped down on the step below them with the easy directness only a 9-year-old could manage. "Are you Dad's friend?" she asked Megan, looking up with the kind of open curiosity that expected a simple answer to a simple question. Megan smiled, and it was a real smile, but something behind her eyes dropped half an inch, like the question had landed somewhere she hadn't braced for. "I think I am," she said. Ellie seemed satisfied with that and went back to chasing the moth. Jason said nothing, but he noticed the way Megan's hands had gone still in her lap for a moment, the way she'd chosen her words like she was picking her way across something narrow. He didn't know what it meant. He only knew that whatever she was carrying had gotten a little heavier that afternoon, and that he wanted, more than he was ready to admit, to be someone she could set it down in front of. Rain almost never brought Megan home early, but it did that Wednesday, a flight rerouted around a storm system that left her walking through her own front door at 6 in the evening instead of the following Saturday. She found Jason on a ladder in the downpour, poncho soaked through, fighting a gutter that had backed up and started sheeting water down the side of the house. "You didn't have to do this tonight," she said, holding the door open, rain blowing sideways into the entryway. "Didn't want your foundation flooding while you were 3 states away," he said, and climbed down once the water started running clean again, both of them soaked through by the time he did. She made coffee she didn't need, and he stayed longer than either of them planned, water running to steam off his jacket by the fireplace, and somewhere between the second cup and the sound of rain easing off the roof, the conversation went somewhere it hadn't gone before. He told her about the year after his wife died. The specific loneliness of a house built for 4 hands that only had 2 left in it, how he'd learned to braid hair from internet videos at 11 at night because there was no one else to ask. She told him, carefully, in pieces that didn't add up to a full picture, about the particular isolation of being the only person in a room who couldn't afford to look uncertain, of a kind of solitude that came from being surrounded by people who needed things from her rather than people who simply wanted to know how her week had gone. Neither of them said the word career. Neither of them needed to. It wasn't a wall between them, so much as a room in each of their houses the other had simply never been shown. And that evening, for the first time, they both understood the other had a room like that too, without either one asking to see inside it. "You're good at this," she said at one point, meaning something larger than the gutter, and he understood that and didn't correct her. "So are you," he said, meaning something larger than the coffee, and she let that sit between them without deflecting it the way she usually would have. It was close to 8 when her phone started buzzing on the counter, once, then again, 30 seconds later, then a third time before she'd even reached for it. She glanced at the screen, and something crossed her face that Jason had started to recognize, not fear exactly, but the particular alertness of a person whose quiet is never guaranteed to last. "Sorry," she said, silencing it. "Rough week at work. It'll keep till Monday." He didn't ask what kind of work made a Sunday through Wednesday feel like a countdown. It had never been the question between them, and it still wasn't, even with the air in the room different than it had been an hour before. He gathered his jacket, thanked her for the coffee, and left her standing in the doorway with her phone buzzing again in her hand, watching his taillights disappear down the wet street, wondering how much longer the door between their 2 lives could stay shut before something on either side pushed it open on its own. The following Sunday started like all the others, mower running, coffee cooling untouched on the porch rail, Ellie stretched out in the shade with a paperback she wasn't really reading. It was the one morning of the week anyone at Meridian Supply Co. could reliably reach Megan Price, and everyone there knew it, which was why the call came through at 9:40 exactly, the way it always did when something couldn't wait for Monday. She stepped away from the mower's noise to take it, phone pressed to her ear, back half turned to the yard, and Jason cut the engine a moment later, close enough now that her voice carried clean across the quiet. "No," she said, flat and immediate, the softness she carried around the house gone from her voice entirely. "Suspend that file today. I'm not signing anything before the audit clears it. Tell Kimball I want him in my office Monday morning, in person, no calls." Jason stood with the mower handle still in his grip, the name landing in him like a stone dropped into still water. Kimball. Not a common name. Not one he'd have expected to hear in his own neighbor's backyard on a Sunday morning, spoken with the kind of authority that only came from someone who could actually make a vice president show up somewhere he didn't want to be. She ended the call and turned around, already reaching to pocket the phone, already halfway back into the version of herself that watered tomatoes and laughed at his jokes, and found him staring at her the way you stare at someone you're suddenly not sure you know. "You're," he started, and had to stop and start again. "You're the CEO of Meridian?" The question hit her harder than she expected. Not because he'd guessed it, but because of the particular certainty in how he'd said it, not curious the way a stranger would be curious, but recognizing, the way a person recognizes a name they already understand the weight of. A man cutting her grass on weekends had no ordinary reason to know exactly which company that name belonged to, or to say it back to her like it explained something he'd been circling for weeks. "How do you know that name?" she said, quieter now, not a question so much as the beginning of one. Jason set the mower handle down slow, like his hands needed somewhere else to be. "I worked there," he said. "Warehouse and receiving. Quality control lead. 4 months ago I got cut in a restructuring, 40 of us. All at once, no warning." He watched something shift across her face, disbelief folding into something closer to dread. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear to you, I didn't know who you were. I just knew that name from a memo that got buried right before I lost my job." Neither of them had meant for it to come out like this, not a confession, not a reveal engineered by either of them, just two people standing in a yard where the truth had simply run out of room to stay hidden any longer. Megan felt the ground she'd been standing on for 10 Sundays tilt sideways, every conversation they'd ever had, reorganizing itself in her memory around a fact she hadn't known, was sitting between them the entire time. "Jason," she started, and didn't know how to finish it. He was already gathering his tools, movements careful and quiet, the same way a man moves when he's trying not to make a bad moment worse. "I should go," he said, not unkindly, just final. He didn't look back at the porch. He didn't call for Ellie to hurry. He just left, and Megan stood alone in her own yard, mower silent, coffee cold, holding a name she now understood in a way that made her stomach turn. Jason didn't come the following Sunday. He told himself it was because the fence didn't need fixing and the gutters were clear, and he told himself that for exactly as long as it took him to notice, he was avoiding the window that faced her yard. It wasn't anger at her. Not really, he understood, somewhere underneath the ache, that she hadn't known any more than he had. It was the layoff itself, climbing back up out of the ground he'd buried it in, 4 months of humiliation and job applications that went nowhere, all of it dragged back into daylight by a single name spoken into a phone. Megan spent that week the way she spent very few weeks anymore, alone, at her own kitchen table at midnight, going through personnel files she should have delegated to someone else and refused to. She found Jason Miller's record eventually, buried in a restructuring list 40 names long, the kind of document built to be skimmed and never actually read. But she read it, and halfway down, she found the line that made her sit back in her chair. A promotion recommendation, drafted and dated, Regional Operations Manager, submitted by his direct supervisor 8 days before the restructuring list was finalized. And beneath it, a single line of approval history showing the recommendation had been withdrawn, not denied, withdrawn, the kind of quiet cancellation that left no formal record of why. The signature authorizing the withdrawal belonged to Roger Kimball. The same week, buried 3 folders deeper, sat an unresolved inventory discrepancy flagged by the same employee, a gap in receiving numbers just under 6 figures that had been logged and never once followed up on. She sat with it a long time, the numbers arranging themselves into a shape she didn't want to see. A man who found a hole in the books. A promotion pulled the same week he found it. A layoff that swallowed him whole under the cover of 39 other names, so ordinary on paper that nobody, including her, had ever thought to ask a single question about it. She didn't call him. She drove to his house instead, arriving at the fence line between their yards on a Tuesday evening, still in her work clothes, looking less like a chief executive than she had all year. "I found it," she said, before he'd even fully opened the door. The promotion, the discrepancy, Kimball's signature on both. Jason stood on his own porch, arms crossed, not inviting her closer, not telling her to leave either. "You didn't know," he said. "It wasn't a question. I believe that. But your company took 11 years of my life and buried it under 39 other names so nobody would ever have to look at it twice. That happened whether you signed off on it or not." "I know," she said, and there was no defense in it, None of the careful language she used in board meetings. I let it happen because I trusted the wrong person to run something I should have been watching closer. That's on me too, even if I never saw your name until Sunday. He didn't say anything for a long moment, and she let him have the silence because she understood, standing there, that an apology only meant something if it could survive being unanswered. "What are you going to do about it?" he finally said. "Everything I should have done the moment I saw it," she said. "I'm opening a formal investigation into Kimball tomorrow morning. I don't care what it costs me on the board." He studied her face for a long time, looking for the version of her that had signed off on his ruin without knowing it, and finding instead only the woman who'd held a ladder steady for him on a dozen ordinary Sundays. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a door left open instead of shut. The board convened on a Thursday, 7 members around a table that had seen quieter mornings, Megan standing at the head of it with a folder thick enough to make Roger Kimball's jaw tighten the moment he saw it. She laid it out plainly, the withdrawn promotion, the buried discrepancy, the timeline that put his signature at the center of both, 3 weeks apart, 4 months before a routine restructuring that had never been routine at all. Kimball didn't deny the paperwork. He couldn't. Instead, he turned it around, voice pitched to sound wounded rather than caught. "This is coming from a personal relationship," he said, looking at Megan directly. "You've been quietly involved with a former employee for weeks, and now, conveniently, his termination is the centerpiece of an investigation into me. I'd ask this board to consider how that looks." The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when someone has said something ugly and true enough at the edges to be dangerous. Megan didn't flinch. "I found this discrepancy in a file I pulled myself. On a night nobody asked me to pull it," she said. "The relationship you're describing is a neighbor who mowed my lawn on weekends without knowing my name meant anything at all. If you'd like to argue the numbers instead of the optics, Roger, I'm happy to walk through every line." It was Jason, 3 days later, who gave the board something no personal history could touch: copies of his own original discrepancy report, still saved on a personal drive from his last week at the company, timestamps intact, the exact figures Kimball's paperwork had quietly buried. He hadn't wanted to hand it over. Standing in the conference room in a borrowed tie, 4 months removed from ever expecting to walk back into that building, was its own kind of reopening a wound he'd only just started letting close. But he laid the documents on the table anyway, because the numbers didn't care how it felt to be the one presenting them, and because somebody had needed to say what actually happened, plainly, a long time ago. "I didn't file this to get anyone promoted," he told the board. "I filed it because it was my job to catch things like this. I got fired for doing my job well enough to find something somebody didn't want found." Kimball's lawyer objected to the framing. The board listened anyway. One of the older board members, a woman who had sat on Meridian's board longer than Roger Kimball had worked there, asked Jason a single question before the vote: why he'd kept the report at all, 4 months after the company had let him go. He thought about it before answering. "Because I was proud of the work," he said. Losing the job didn't change that it was true. By the end of the session, exhausted and quiet in a way boardrooms rarely were, the vote came down clean. Roger Kimball suspended immediately. Pending the outcome of a full financial review, his access to company systems revoked before he'd even left the building. It wasn't the end of it. Everyone in the room understood that. But it was the first time in 4 months that Jason had watched a room full of powerful people take his word seriously without him having to fight for every inch of it, and something in his chest loosened that he hadn't realized was still clenched. Megan walked him out afterward, neither of them saying much, both of them aware that the hardest part, the part where trust either survived what had happened or didn't, was still somewhere ahead of them, waiting for a quieter room than this one. The investigation took 11 days to close, and when it did, it closed hard. Roger Kimball was terminated for cause. His conduct referred to state financial regulators for a pattern of falsified inventory reporting that auditors traced back nearly 2 years, a scheme worth just under $1.4 million in unaccounted losses, quietly absorbed into other line items, so it would never draw a second look. The report named Jason Miller's original discrepancy flag as the first documented instance anyone had caught it, 4 months before he lost his job for catching it. Megan called an all-staff meeting the following Monday, something Meridian hadn't done in years outside of a crisis, and stood in front of the same warehouse floor Jason used to walk every morning to say, without softening any of it, that the company had wrongfully terminated an employee to protect a man who was stealing from it, and that the failure to catch it sooner sat with leadership, herself included. She'd asked Jason to be there. He almost didn't come. He stood near the back in a jacket that didn't quite fit anymore, watching people he used to eat lunch with turn around in their seats when they recognized him, a few nodding, one or two mouthing an apology across the room he didn't need, but didn't mind receiving either. When she found him afterward, in a hallway mostly empty of people, she didn't offer him a script. "I'd like to reinstate you," she said. "Regional operations, the position you should have had 4 months ago. I understand if that's not something you want anymore." He thought about it longer than either of them expected. "I don't think I do," he said finally. "Not because of anything you did. I built something else, this past 4 months. I'm not sure I want to trade it for an office with your name above mine on an org chart." He paused. "But I appreciate you saying it in front of everyone instead of just to me. You're allowed to want something different," she said, "and I'm still sorry, either way." "I know," he said. "I believe you." The board vote came 2 days later, 7-1, affirming Megan's leadership through the crisis and formally closing the investigation into her own conduct, which had never truly been in question except in Kimball's last, desperate attempt to make it one. It was, by every measure that mattered to a company her size, a clean resolution, the kind quarterly reports are built around, the kind that gets a company's stock back on solid footing within a news cycle. None of that was what stayed with her that evening. What stayed with her was standing on Jason Miller's front step at 7 o'clock, no folder in her hands, no title attached to the visit, just a neighbor who'd walked over because she didn't know how else to end a week like that one. She'd changed out of her office clothes first, without quite admitting to herself why it mattered, and stood there now in jeans and an old sweater, feeling more like herself than she had in 11 days. "I'm not here as anybody's CEO," she said when he opened the door. "I know," he said, and stepped back to let her in. "You never really were, to me." The Sunday after that was quieter than the ones before it, in the particular way a house feels quieter once something heavy has finally been set down. Jason arrived a little after 8, same as always, and found Megan already outside, 2 cups of coffee in her hands instead of 1, waiting on the porch steps like she'd been standing there longer than she needed to be. Ellie ran ahead of him across the grass toward the side yard, where the basil plant she and Megan had repotted weeks earlier had finally taken, green and unruly, leaning toward the morning sun. "It bloomed," Ellie announced, delighted, crouching to inspect a small white flower at the top of one stem, and turned to call over her shoulder, easy and unthinking, the way children say things that carry more weight than they know. "Miss Megan, come look." Megan crossed the yard and knelt beside her, and it struck Jason, watching from the porch, how naturally his daughter's mouth had shaped that name, not a guest anymore. Not a stranger who happened to live next door, just Miss Megan, the way she'd probably say it for years without remembering there had ever been a version of this where that wasn't true. He carried the second cup of coffee out to where the two of them knelt over the little plant, and Megan looked up at him with something steadier in her eyes than he'd seen there since the phone call that had first cracked their careful arrangement open. "You didn't have to bring coffee," he said, taking the cup anyway, his hand closing over hers for a moment longer than the handoff required, and neither of them pulled away first this time. "I wanted an excuse to stay out here longer," she said. And it wasn't a line, it was just true, said plainly, the way the truth had finally started to sound between them. They didn't talk about the company that morning, or the board, or the 4 months that had almost kept them from ever standing in this yard together at all. They talked about the basil, and about a swing set Ellie wanted for her birthday, and about nothing in particular, the way people talk when the thing underneath the words has already been settled, and doesn't need saying out loud anymore. Later, when Ellie had wandered off to chase something only she could see, Megan mentioned, careful and unhurried, that Meridian would be restructuring its Regional Operations Advisory Board and that she'd like Jason's name on it, not as an employee, not under anyone, just as an outside voice the company owed the courtesy of finally listening to. He said he'd think about it. They both knew he'd already decided. Neither of them had ever planned a single one of their Sundays. Nobody had extended an invitation, and nobody had ever accepted one out loud. It had simply kept happening, week after week, two people finding their way into the same yard without either of them fully understanding why, until the answer had become impossible to miss sitting there in the coffee going cold between them, in the plant that had finally bloomed, in a girl calling a name across the grass like she'd always known it. They had never once meant to become each other's Sunday. But that was exactly what they had become, and now, at last, they both understood why. The coffee went cold in both their cups before either of them thought to drink it, and neither one minded. Somewhere behind them, Ellie was singing something tuneless to the basil plant, and the morning kept doing what mornings did, unhurried, indifferent to how long it had taken two people to arrive at something this simple.